Boys and girls, today we're gonna talk about war. I know, a wholesome way to start the weekend, right? If you've ever read the Old Testament, you know that it's absolutely packed with violence. You got battles, floods, wrestling matches with angels, and a few ethnic cleansings. To explain these more troublesome verses, believers will usually turn towards the Christian apologists, who are specially trained to do their best to rationalize what they read in the text with the idea of a benevolent deity. Now, some of these apologists are better than others, but now imagine Stephen Lett, the silliest member of the governing body, trying to justify the violence of the Old Testament. Yeah, it's gonna be a complete disaster. We're gonna be watching this morning worship talk titled, "Why Did Israel Go to War? But Why Don't Christians Do Today?" Presented by a younger Stephen Lett before he got all bloated.
But sometimes in the ministry and other places, when we try to bring up our stand regarding not participating in war, our Christian neutrality, people will bring up the objection about the Israelites. They'll say, well, they were God's people. They fought wars, so why can't Christians fight in wars? How do you deal with that argument?
You don't. You just kind of put the doubts in the back of your head until the cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable.
Well, if you're going to overcome that, you obviously have to show them there's a vast difference between the Israelites in Bible times and true Christians today. In fact, let's briefly discuss 5 differences. Number 1, in the days of the Israelites, God's people were gathered into one nation. So when they went into battle against the pagan nations, they weren't killing fellow believers. They weren't killing their brothers. But today, Revelation 7:9 says that the great crowd of true Christians is scattered in all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues. So if Christians participated in war today, what would happen? We would end up killing fellow believers, our brothers.
It's very telling that the only people who Stephen considers his brothers are other Jehovah's Witnesses. I thought Jesus instructed us to love everyone, even if they don't belong to our same religion. Are we even reading the same Bible, Led? So, in case you don't know, dear viewer, Jehovah's Witnesses are not allowed to serve in the military in any shape or form. Watchtower constantly attacks other religions whose members do participate in wars, even though their God Jehovah initiated a bunch of wars in the Old Testament. But let's see how Stephen justifies that.
And of course, we know that is happening among ones who claim to be God's people who take up the sword. We find Catholic killing their fellow Catholics. We find the same thing among the Methodists, the Baptists, Muslims, slaughtering members of their own religion. Makes me think of a conversation I had many years ago with a high-ranking Mormon elder. And I asked him, I said, well, what is your position on war? He said, we don't like war. I said, but what do you do, though? If you're living in a country at a time, there's a draft, you're drafted into the military. He said, well, if the government makes this to us, it's their responsibility. We go ahead and fight. I said, do you then kill another Mormon on the battlefield? Because I know you have Mormons in many different countries. He said, well, if I knew he was a Mormon, I'd let him go. I said, but normally, it's not possible to check with each person before you shoot them.
Checkmate, Mormons.
Well, he didn't admit it, but obviously he got the point that was made there. But now let's go to our second difference. Jehovah God, who can read hearts, personally judged as worthy of execution the people the Israelites went up against. He directly told them to execute his judgment on these demon-worshiping people whose worship included gross sexual immorality, even child sacrifice.
Yeah, and those God-sanctioned executions included hundreds of babies whose only crime was to be born into the wrong culture. There are verses in the Old Testament where God commands the Israelites to destroy everyone in a particular city, including the women and infants. Of course, Stephen Lett and other apologists just completely ignore the subject, those verses, and instead they focus on the sin of the adults. So the Canaanites were performing child sacrifice. Yeah, that's awful, but God addresses that sin by destroying even more infants, which to me reflects the mind of a psychopath, not that of a benevolent creator. But go ahead, Stephen, tell us why the Canaanite babies deserved dying.
Open up to Leviticus chapter 18, please, and notice an example of Jehovah telling the Israelites concerning the Canaanites. Now, here's what he said. Leviticus 18, verse 24, Jehovah says, "Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for it is by all these things that the nations that I am driving out from before you have made themselves unclean. Therefore the land is unclean, and I will bring punishment on it for its error, and the land will vomit its inhabitants out." So Jehovah told them to execute his judgment on these people.
So my question is, why couldn't God execute the judgment himself? I mean, he did it in the past already, right? When he drowned thousands of people in the flood, including babies, and he had already destroyed all the firstborns of Egypt in a horrible plague. So why did Big J just change his mind now and say, oh yeah, you know what, actually, I want the Israelites, my chosen people whom I love so much, yeah, I want them to slit the throats of their Canaanite neighbors so they can undergo the horrific trauma that comes with ending the life of another human being. And it's not like the ancient Israelites had access to technology that modern armies do. Like, modern armies are able to click a button and then they destroy a residential building, killing dozens of people. No, these ancient warriors had to kill people up close, personally, by methods that are just beyond cruel. Slitting throats, throwing people off cliffs, or besieging a city and forcing people to starve or commit cannibalism. So Stephen, why would a loving God mandate people to kill others? To me, it's inconceivable.
Now here's our third difference. The Israelite wars kill selectively. And we have just two examples of many that could be related. Joshua chapter 6 shows that Rahab and her entire household were miraculously spared. Why? Because Rahab exercised faith in Jehovah. Or what about Joshua chapters 9 and 10? Talks about how Jehovah spared the Gibeonites, who were actually in line for destruction, because they exercised faith in Jehovah.
Well, since you love the book of Joshua so much, why don't we turn to chapter 8, in which we read about the destruction of the city of Ai. Let's read. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you and go up and attack Ai. For I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off their plunder and livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the city." Verse 24, when Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness, where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not draw back the hand that held out his javelin until he had destroyed all who lived in Ai. But Israel did carry off for themselves the livestock and plunder of the city, as the Lord had instructed Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a permanent heap of ruins, a desolate place to this day. He impaled the body of the king of Ai on a pole and left it there until the evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered them to take the body from the pole and throw it down at the entrance of the city gate. And they raised a large pile of rocks over it, which remains to this day. I mean, guys, the text is very explicit. The Israelites defeated all the men of the city, but that wasn't enough for them. No, they wanted more blood. God wanted more blood. So they turned towards the city and destroyed everyone there. Now, I wonder, who would have been at the city if all the fighting men were dead? Well, women and children. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. And I don't believe I'm taking anything out of context here. You can go and read the passage for yourself. We're talking about the destruction of an entire city, including women and children. And this is not the Israelite army going trigger happy, going rogue, and going against God's commands. No, they were following God's explicit commands to destroy anything that lives. This is God Himself commanding the destruction of women and children, non-combatants, something which today we would classify as a war crime. But of course, Stephen Lett has amnesia apparently and fails to mention these texts. Instead, he cherry picks the only 2 instances in the book of Joshua where God decides to spare people: Rahab and the Gibeonites. I'm sorry, Stephen, I'm just not buying it.
Now, that's just a couple of examples, but in today's wars, are people spared because of their obedience and faith? No. Often the civilian casualties are greater than the soldier casualties when they drop their bombs. The collateral damage, as they call it, often results in substantial death of innocent people.
Like the Battle of Ai?
Let's get our 4th difference now. The Israelite soldiers were required to conduct their warfare according to Jehovah's guidelines. Now, here are just a few examples of Jehovah's guidelines, of many that could be related. Open up to Deuteronomy chapter 23, please. Deuteronomy 23. And notice what Jehovah told the Israelite army, the soldiers. Deuteronomy 23, beginning in verse 9. When you are encamped against your enemies, you should avoid anything bad. Look at verse 12. A private place should be designated for use outside the camp. They would go out there and relieve themselves. See, why? Look at verse 14. For Jehovah your God is walking about within your camp to deliver you and to hand over your enemies to you. And your camp must be holy, so that he does not see anything indecent in you and turn away from accompanying you.
So Israelite soldiers taking a shit inside the camp would cause Jehovah to abandon them, but them killing other human beings is fine? You just can't make this up.
Yes, Jehovah required cleanliness among these Israelite soldiers because actually they were sanctified for warfare.
Just stop and think about what he just said. Sanctified for warfare. That's terrifying. I mean, what's the difference between this and modern jihadists, right? Don't they use the same reasoning? A holy war? And Stephen Lett just says it like it's nothing.
But now, what about soldiers today? Obviously very different. In fact, the Insight book talks about how that they were certainly not allowed to any of the conquered cities' women. In fact, they couldn't even marry such a woman for 1 month. Page 173 of the Insight book, you can get a lot of Jehovah's guidelines that he gave to the Israelite soldiers.
So I actually went to the Insight book that he's quoting, and it states this: the armies of pagan nations often raped the women of conquered cities, but not so the victorious soldiers of Israel, nor were they permitted for a month to marry a captive woman. But notice how there is no Bible verse quoted to support this idea that Israelites were banned from abusing war captives. That's because you won't find such a prohibition in the Bible. anywhere. Sure, you could imply that God commanded soldiers to abstain from sex before the battle, therefore that means that they could not rape a conquered woman, but the fact that there's no outright prohibition on sexual assault is just gross. Hell, if you actually look at the context of the few verses after this, things just get worse. If you go to war against your enemies and Jehovah your God defeats them for you and you take them captive and you see among the captives a beautiful woman and you are attracted to her and you want to take her as your wife, you may bring her into your house. She should then shave her head, attend to her nails, and remove the clothing of her captivity and dwell in your house. She will weep for her father and her mother a whole month, and afterward you may have relations with her. You will become her husband, and she will become your wife. How is this not rape? An Israelite soldier conquers a city, finds one of the surviving virgin girls, then she has to shave her head, she's given 1 month to mourn her parents, and then she's forced into marriage with the man who killed her family. All of this against her consent. Oh, but it's all well and good because she's raped after 1 month instead of immediately, right? Get the fuck out of here. Oh, but it gets even worse because if you keep reading, it says, "But if you are not pleased with her, you should then let her go wherever she wishes, but you may not sell her for money or treat her harshly, since you have humiliated her." So, if the soldier is not happy with his new captive wife, he has the freedom to toss her outside like used good. Honestly, it makes me sick. Are these Jehovah's loving guidelines you're talking about, Stephen? See guys, this is why I have such a hard time taking biblical morality seriously. When a believer accuses me of not having an objective moral standpoint, I kind of just laugh at this point, because if this is your objective morality, if you're taking your morality from this book, I don't want anything to do with it.
So you could truly say that the Israelite wars were holy wars, but the wars of today's wicked world are anything but holy. No wonder Jesus said that theocratic warfare would no longer include the use of physical weapons. Remember what he said in Matthew 26:52? He said, "Those that take up the sword will die, perish by the sword." And he taught his followers not to harm their enemies, in fact, to even pray for them. And his position, of course, is in harmony with Jehovah's prophecy at Isaiah 2:2-4, that in the final part of the days, God's people would beat their swords into plowshares, and they would not even learn war anymore, much less participate in it.
Well, thank goodness you don't participate in war, because your religion already causes enough damage as it is. What an insane talk. Justifying war crimes and sexual violence. How more twisted can you get? Now, you might be wondering, dear viewer, Panda, why do you get so riled up if you're not a believer anymore? This was the Old Testament, you know? It's a thing of the past. Well, dear viewer, the thing with justifying atrocities, even if they happened in the past, and even if they never happened at all, is that this type of reasoning is still being used today. You can justify any atrocity against innocent people when you truly believe that your war is a holy war. We see it with jihadists like ISIS, and we see it with the war criminals in the IDF. It's quite terrifying how religion can help us justify things that in any other context we would consider obscene. You know, one of my favorite parts of leaving the Jehovah's Witness religion, and by extension Christianity, is that I no longer have to justify the more troublesome verses in this book. I no longer feel the pressure to, defend a deity who called for the extermination of innocent people and for sexual violence against women. Trust me, I don't miss it at all. But hey, if you're a believer watching this, I'm curious, How do you justify these atrocious war passages? Feel free to leave a comment below and I would be glad to read it. I know these are very sensitive topics and I don't mean to belittle your faith, but I'm genuinely curious. How can you justify these passages that we covered today? Let me know in the comments below. But I think for now, both believers and unbelievers, I think we can agree that Stephen Lett is the least qualified person to talk about these complex moral issues. Let me remind you, this is someone who referred to babies as little enemies of God and who salivates for the destruction of everyone who speaks against his bullshit. So yeah, Steven, please don't defend war crimes ever again. Guys, as always, a huge thank you to my YouTube channel members and my Patreons. None of this would be possible without your support. If you would like to support my channel, please head on over to Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. It's only $1 a month and you gain early access to all my videos. Thank you so much. Take it easy, guys. Have a wonderful day and stay away from ethnic cleansings.
Bah. Goodbye, little sheep.